Okay, so now you have your camera, it's time to learn one of the most fundamental rules or basic principles of photography, and that is the exposure triangle. Okay, now the exposure triangle often sounds really daunting, but trust me, it's incredibly simple. It consists of three basic principles that once you understand how they work together and individually, you'll be able to take any kind of image that you would like and expose it correctly. All right, so the basic fundamentals of the exposure triangle are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's start by talking about aperture. Aperture is essentially the iris of the lens. It's the opening in the back of the lens that as you open it wider or shut it down smaller will control the amount of light that travels through the lens to the sensor. Now when you open that iris right up wide, we start talking about this as being wide open. A wide open iris or a wide open aperture will essentially affect two things. It will affect the amount of light that travels through the lens to the sensor, but it will also affect how shallow the field of focus is, your depth of field will be in your image. Now, if you've seen those images of, say, a model or something where the face is perfectly exposed, but the background's all soft and dreamy, that's because it's been shot with a wide aperture or a large aperture. When you shut that aperture down to a small aperture, say f16 or f22, you start to really limit the amount of light that can travel through the lens to the sensor. And the other effect of this is that the focal distance or the focal plane of your shot becomes much more deep. So you'll start to notice a lot more things that are in focus. The foreground, the middle, and the background will be much sharper and in focus. This is often used in landscape photography. Okay, shutter speed. Now this is fairly self-explanatory, but essentially when you have a fast shutter speed, you're actually limiting the amount of light that comes through to the sensor. This is fantastic when you really want to freeze the action, freeze the moment, particularly in things like sports photography or wildlife photography. As you slow that shutter speed down, you start to allow motion blur. Things that are moving within the frame are allowed to blur a little bit in the image. This is used primarily in long exposure photography, but also in things like panning shots. But we'll talk about those techniques in more advanced tutorials. Lastly, we have ISO. Now, simply put, ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to light. There are other aspects to ISO being with gains and things like that, but we're going to keep it simple in this moment and just talk a little bit about how you can utilize ISO and what effects it'll have on your image. By keeping your ISO quite low, you're actually allowing the light to not impact the sensor greatly. So the exposure time is going to be extended. You're going to either need to open your aperture wider or slow your shutter speed down to allow adequate amount of exposure time. When you start to push that ISO to higher numbers, say 3200, 6400, 12800, you're going to get a much quicker exposure. The light that hits the sensor is going to make a much bigger impact on the sensor. However, you start to introduce noise to your image as you go higher. Essentially, that's all the exposure triangle is, understanding those three main elements. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please hit the notification and subscribe buttons. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment below. The next video will be up shortly, and as always, happy shooting.